This is a talk series being organized by the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy in response to the critical humanitarian and human rights issues of our time. It's a complement, really, to the series organized by our faculty director, Matthias Riese, The Fierce Urgency of Now, which over the course of last year featured a range of scholars and professors from across Harvard who talked on a range of human rights issues. And this series will draw upon external policymakers, practitioners, social change activists, and so on. Today it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Mike Abramowitz, who is the president of Freedom House. Before joining Freedom House in February 2017, he was the director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Institute for Holocaust Education, where he led their genocide prevention efforts and their public education programs. He was previously with the Washington Post, where he served as national editor and White House correspondent. We're really honored to have Mike here with us today. And for those of you who aren't aware of Freedom House, it's a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, which defends human rights and promotes democratic change with a focus on political rights and civil liberties. They do this through analysis, advocacy, and action. They work on a range of issues, including human rights, civil society, freedom of expression, internet freedom, rule of law, and LGBT rights. So the format for today's session is that Mike will lead us through some opening remarks on their most recent report, Freedom in the World, which just got issued this week, actually. I'll open it up with some framing questions for him and then turn it over to you to ask questions. The conversation is on the record, it's being recorded, shared on social media as well. So when we turn it over for questions, it would be great if you could identify yourself and have a brief question, ideally one sentence that ends with a question mark. We will be ending at 1, so in the interest of time, we'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. So let me turn it over to you, Mike, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sushma, for inviting me here. It's really an honor to be at the Carr Center. I thought I would just start by telling this group a little bit about Freedom House. Since I have the floor, I'd like to tell you about it because I think it's an interesting organization. And while we're probably the oldest, arguably one of the oldest human rights organizations in the United States, people sometimes don't know that much about us. So we were actually founded in 1941. And I tell this story today because we were founded to confront the America First movement of the era. That was the reason for Freedom House. It was a group of people who were deeply concerned about American isolationism, about the rise of fascism in Europe, and they wanted to basically create a group that would essentially get the American public behind war in Europe. And just remember, at the time, 90% of Americans did not want to get involved in the European war. And obviously that changed after Pearl Harbor, but Freedom House was ahead of the curve. And the other thing that I always find very moving to me about the founding of Freedom House is that our founding patrons were Eleanor Roosevelt and also Wendell Willkie, who had run against Eleanor's husband in 1940 unsuccessfully for president, obviously. And that was this idea of a bipartisan or really nonpartisan support for the core values of democracy has really been kind of very much core to what Freedom House is about. So I just wanted to start with that bit of historical context. Obviously things are a lot different today than 78 years ago. Freedom House, as Sushma indicated, we do 3 things. We do on-the-ground programming around the world in about 25 different countries where we support human rights defenders, human rights activists, civil society in strengthening their capacity to advocate for their rights and to advocate on behalf of democracy. We do advocacy in Washington and in the United States, and that's something, by the way, that I think we'd like to grow more over the next number of years. And then finally, the thing that we're probably best known for is our research on democracy, on core freedoms, and our signature report, which Sushma alluded to, is called Freedom in the World, which we released this week. And that's the cover of Freedom in the World this year. This is a report that we've been doing for some 50 years. And what you'll see is freedom going up in smoke, and you've got really the the world's really the bad guys. You got the Saudi prince there pouring gasoline on the fire, and we've got our president who's toasting a marshmallow. He's set apart from the autocrats, but he is. But we're not doing enough. He's not doing enough to confront the problem. And that's actually the theme of our report this year, which came out, as Sushma said, on Tuesday. So this is our map, which we have been doing for, again, since 1972. And what freedom in the world is essentially an index project that's focused on measuring core political rights and civil liberties. And we analyze each country in the world, roughly 200 or so, and we rate them according to our 24 different indicators, and then those ratings are turned into a global score of 0 to 100. And then we also then group the countries into 3 categories: free, partly free, and not free. So the green is the free countries, purple obviously not free, and we are, our aspiration at Freedom House is really our long-term goal. Probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but is to turn the map green. That's what we talk about at Freedom House. This gives you just a snapshot of the global picture. So we have roughly 7.6 billion people living in the world. About 39% of them, 2/5, living in free countries. About 1/3 living in not free countries. And these numbers have been changing over the last 13 years. Larry Diamond, the professor at Stanford, who's kind of one of the experts on democracy, has called it a democracy recession, and that's captured in our scores at Freedom House. So this is the 13th consecutive year that there have been more countries that have been declining in political rights and civil liberties than those that are having an improvement in political rights and civil liberties. So and so those numbers are creeping up. I think the 44% of countries that are free is a little bit down from 13 years ago, which is I think 46 to 47% 13 years ago. So the numbers are going not in a good direction. This chart kind of shows some of the largest gains and then also the improvements. So I'll just give you a quick sort of snapshot of some of, I think, the key findings of this year's report. Number one, as I said, 13th consecutive year of global decline in freedom. I think what's interesting is that in the early part of this recession, you had countries, autocratic countries, kind of getting worse. And now what you've seen in the last couple of years is that consolidated democracies weakening, including our country, which we can get to, but countries like Germany, France, Belgium, etc. This year, the biggest decline was in Nicaragua. That's 12 points. That's big for a Freedom House over 1 year, and that's obviously because of the crackdown on protesters in Nicaragua. I think one notable change this year doesn't show up in the annual number, but Hungary has been on a steady decline for the last decade or so under Prime Minister Orban, and this was the first year that Hungary crossed from free to not free. People who study Hungary, that's not going to be a surprise to them, but it is interesting because Hungary is the first country in the EU to be ever rated by Freedom House as less than fully free. So it's just a sign of kind of the deterioration of democratic standards in Hungary. A couple other points that I would make before opening up for questions or discussion with Sushma. Nicaragua, the biggest decline. I also like to talk about success stories. Interesting, 4 countries this year did quite well, marked improvements in our numbers. Angola, Armenia, Malaysia, and Ethiopia. These are significant countries regionally. I think Ethiopia and Angola are interesting because you had kind of reforming leaders come from the ruling party and liberalizing, kind of like maybe Gorbachev during the Soviet era. And then you've got countries, Armenia and Malaysia, where the populations were essentially very unhappy with the direction of the government. In Malaysia, huge corruption scandal. They threw out the prime minister, and to me that's important because it really signals that the ongoing importance of having elections. As we can discuss, autocrats have become quite skillful at kind of staging rigged elections. But elections do offer an opportunity, in certain cases, for the people to have a voice. A couple other trends I just wanted to highlight that I think are interesting. One of our findings globally this year is we found 24 countries that are targeting their dissidents beyond their borders. So the case of Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia, being targeted by the Crown Prince is just the most visible indicator of a global trend that we're seeing countries like Turkey, Russia, etc., going after their political opponents, not just within their own borders, but beyond their borders. I think another interesting finding, which I think we need to kind of unpack over the next couple of months, is there's a kind of a return of ethnic cleansing. We recorded in 2018 11 countries that had either engaged in ethnic cleansing or tried to basically reorient their population by deporting people. The famous case is in Western China with the re-education camps that have been set up by the Chinese government. But this is a larger trend, and there are only 3 countries that we marked down for ethnic cleansing in 2005. So that just gives you a sense of the issue there. I do want to close with some comments about the U.S., and I'm going to be brief here. Freedom House has always, as part of our reports, looked at the health of U.S. democracy and freedoms here. In fact, before I became the president of Freedom House 10 years ago, we did a whole book-length study about Americans How Free. And for every one of our reports, whether it's freedom of the press, freedom of the net, freedom of the world, we always have an analysis of the U.S. because, for credibility of Freedom House, we can't just be looking overseas at what's happening overseas. We need to look inward. And this year, we decided to take a sort of a special look at the United States democracy. It's the elephant in the room for those who are interested, who care about democracy. I think a couple data points for this group to consider. Number one is American democracy, according to our ratings, has been in decline for about 8 years. There are a lot of different factors about this, but we have marked down the U.S. over the years for lack of transparency in the government, the failure to protect the integrity of elections, a number of different things. This started before Trump, but it's accelerated according to our rankings in the first, certainly in the first year of the presidency. This year, actually, there was no change. We marked the U.S. down a point for the asylum policies, which we look at immigration as part of our analysis. Where it's up to countries to decide what level of immigration they want, but they have to adhere to international human rights and legal standards. And we actually improved the United States in terms of freedom of association because we saw that that was something that was improving in the last year. So the U.S. actually stayed the same this year, but we decided to step back and take a closer look at U.S. democracy. So you'll see, for those of you who follow our work more closely, we typically do a global essay that describes global trends. This year we decided to add to that an essay on the U.S. And I would say one other sort of thematic or philosophical reason we do that is because we really do believe that it's important for the cause of global democracy for the U.S. to be a leader, both in democratic practice, but also in terms of supporting human rights and democracy as part of a foreign policy. And so that's always been in the DNA of Freedom House. Doesn't mean the United States hasn't made mistakes or can't be criticized for things, but we do think that things are better off when the U.S. is a strong exemplar of democratic practice. So that's a theme of our report this year that I wanted to just highlight for this group, and we can sort of talk about that a little bit more. With that, I think I'm going to stop and see what Sushma thinks.
Sure, fascinating. I have no trick questions. I'm wondering if you can talk about how Freedom House uses this report. Do you use it to inform the public, advocate on behalf of particular freedoms, mobilize people in specific countries? How do you approach the work, and what kind of work is done in the United States versus in the countries in which you operate?
Right. Well, this report and the report the other reports we do are sort of at the heart of our advocacy efforts. My whole team is like fanning out over the hill this week, trying to brief people in both parties, briefing AID, briefing the State Department. There's obviously a great deal of interest in our reports overseas. Hungary has already been after us for being a tool of the Soros Foundation, even though we actually don't get money from Soros now. But they're not actually dealing with the actual content of the critique, which we invite. I mean, we recognize that people are going to have different views about our findings, but we think it's a way to kind of stimulate a conversation about these issues. As I said in my remarks earlier, we very much would like to step up our advocacy around these issues. We have a small advocacy team that we're building. We feel, I think philosophically, in the years ahead, we feel that there's a lot of work to be done to bring our findings and our concerns to important American audiences. So that would include, obviously, the Congress, the executive branch, the media. I think the business community has typically found some of our findings of concern. So that's really an area of focus for us at Freedom House, going forward.
Yeah, you mentioned the business community, and in the report you have some recommendations for the private sector at the end. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because when we talk about civil liberties and freedoms like freedom of expression, we often focus on governments and civil society and media and trying to hold governments accountable.
Yes.
So where do you see the space for the private sector, particularly technology companies, in improving basically civil liberties and freedoms for people?
Right. It's interesting, since I've been the president of Freedom House for about 2 years, and I have found it a challenge to speak to the business community about these issues. Actually, our indicators should be of great interest to the business community. Just to think about rule of law is a whole area of analysis that we look at. We look at kind of transparency and corruption issues. Not in the same kind of detail as, say, Transparency International, but that's a factor in our consideration of freedom. So I feel that we need to make a much stronger case to the business community that these values and that are important and that their economic interests are tied up in the flourishing of the values like rule of law in these countries. I mean, I think countries like Russia, which has suffered a dramatic deterioration in our scores over the last 20 years. I think it's hard to get direct investment there right now. So I think we really try to make the case hard. I think the tech communities companies are obviously a major focus of our efforts, and I think it's interesting to watch that, because over the last 8 or 9 years, you've seen a real shift in the attitudes towards tech. 7 or 8 years ago, that was the internet was seen as a liberating technology, and then today, you see all sorts of problems and the ability of autocrats and others to kind of manipulate systems to undermine democracy, social media and so forth. And that's a theme of a whole other set of research for Freedom House. I do think that, I just lost my train of thought on one thing. I do think in terms of, we can dig into this perhaps, Sushma, but the reasons for this global democratic decline, I do think that one solution is going to have to be, really figuring out a regime for the internet that respects human rights and the values that we care about, especially free expression, while at the same time, not giving a license to people to engage in hate speech or other tools that could undermine the strength of democracies. I actually think that's one of the big issues, one of the big challenges, not just for Freedom House, but for us in general.
So you talked about democratic decline over the past 13 years, but there's also glimmers of hope with some countries where you've seen progress, including several African countries. So in the countries where you've seen progress, what are some trends that you've observed that perhaps could be transferred or applicable to other countries that are trying to reverse this decline?
I'm afraid I've talked about this with my staff over the last week or two, because I'm just thinking about events like this. I think there's not enough data to kind of really suggest one strong lesson. I think there's different stories in different countries. So Ethiopia was a really incredible reform, and we actually have a pretty strong. That's one of the countries in Africa we've had a historical interest in, and a strong research team, and they kind of caught a lot of people in the democracy movement by surprise. They had a new prime minister who released political prisoners and was more, tried to liberalize things, and that was just kind of unexpected. But I do come back to the point I made earlier about the importance of elections. Elections do offer an opportunity for the people to be heard, and when you look at some of the countries like Argentina, South Korea, Armenia this year, Malaysia, the countries that have kind of, the change has happened from elections. It's interesting because, and there's a lot of there's a book, How to Rig an Election, by this British academic, some of you who have read it, which really shows how autocrats can have elections, but can basically stage the outcomes by throwing your opponents in jail, by smothering the press coverage so it's one-sided. I was just in Zimbabwe this summer, and I was part of an election monitoring team that was sent by a number of different U.S. groups, and it was very interesting because in some ways it was a very moving experience. There was a lot of people who were very genuinely excited by the opportunity to vote and to have but what we saw is that it's not just what happens on election day, it's the 4 or 5 months before election and how the ruling party tilted the playing field in their direction. And so at the conclusion of the monitors team that I was part of was that this was probably a freer election than we've seen in Zimbabwe in the past, but it still was problematic, and I'm not sure it really truly reflected the will of the people in Zimbabwe. So, but I do think, just going back to elections are critical.